Hi, man. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. There we go. I don't know what you're saying, but I agree with you. All right, who's got Sunday school for the kids this morning? Yeah, that's concerning. Do you have a lesson prepared? You're in church. Okay. All right, well, then the kids will be dismissed to Sunday school at this time. Do you want to watch the live stream? Okay. We are going to be in Luke 12 this morning. Yeah, you're good. These cold mornings make it difficult. Luke 12 will be our next story, our series in Finding Fruit in the Fables of Faith. Our next parable, as it's called, will be in Luke chapter 12. Last parable we talked about, which has been a few weeks now, we talked about, does anybody remember? I know it's early. It's a Sunday morning. Our brains aren't quite geared in. Let's try to lock it in, see if we can remember. It was not the mustard seed. It was not the prodigal son. You're in the right neighborhood. It wasn't that. That one was the one before. Nobody quite remembers. Okay. It was the Good Samaritan. Right. You were. That's why I was saying, like, you're in the ballpark. I knew you were like in the right area. So we talked about the Good Samaritan the last time. This morning, we're talking about one that most of you will probably find familiar. If you've heard a lot of preaching or teaching, you've probably heard this story before. At Gospel Light, they used to have a week for, what did he call it when Brother House would come by? Stewardship. The Stewardship Conference.
Yeah, Stewardship Conference.
Yeah, the Stewardship Conference. And he would come by, and one of the lessons he would teach would be what we're talking about this morning. I'm not going to quite take that direction with it this morning. But I really think, because I like to be more, I take a more purist sort of ideology when it comes to the Bible. I don't like to make it say things I want it to say. I like to just let it speak for itself. You heard that old saying by Dr. Spurgeon all those years ago? They talk about defending the Bible. You know, used to, you could have a debate with somebody without it turning into a whole, slobber knocker, people swinging at each other kind of thing. And back then it was called apologetics, and you could take it like a nice debate between a couple people and defend the Bible against somebody who didn't believe it. And they would talk to him about, he's really good at that kind of a thing, and they were talking to him about defending the Bible. And he kind of chuckled and he said, defend the Bible? You don't defend a lion, you just open the cage, right? That's what we do with the Bible. We don't have to defend it, just let it defend itself, right? So this morning, when we talk about Luke 12, I'm going to take maybe a different spin on it, but we'll see. We're going to start reading. It's going to be verse 13. Anytime you hear somebody tell this parable, they start in verse 16, and I think that's a mistake because you're missing the point of the story. Like when we talked about the Good Samaritan, do you remember why Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan? Anybody remember? Exactly. There was a lawyer came up to Jesus and asked him, what are the two great commandments in the Bible? Jesus answered him, and then he said, because one of them is to love thy neighbor as thyself. And he, being a lawyer, trying to debate that out, said, well, who technically is my neighbor? Jesus answers that with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? So that's the story behind that. In Luke 12, it's the same way. Verse 13, he's been preaching for a little bit, and he comes to verse 13. It says, one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. You imagine somebody interrupted me preaching on Sunday morning so that I could settle an argument between them and their sibling? That's what just happened. Jesus answers him in verse 14. He said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? He said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. Mark that verse, underline it, highlight it. If they have invented the flashing neon pen yet, use that one on this verse. This is such an important verse. A man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. This is the polar opposite of what the world teaches us. The world teaches you your worth is in how much money you make. People judge you based on how nice a car you drive. People judge you based off of what kind of neighborhood you live in, how nice a house you live in, what kind of job you have, how nice the clothes you wear are. I used to have people in churches as a young man that would judge me and shame me in front of everybody depending on how nice my shoes were. And right here, Luke 12 in verse 15, Jesus teaching us that our life does not consist in the abundance of the things which we possess. Had one of the disciples very early on in the ministry of our Lord come to him and say, Lord, I'll follow you whithersoever thou goest. And Jesus' response to him was to say, the foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. Jesus lived the life of a homeless person, a vagabond, a man who drifted from town to town. He had no home. It wasn't as if he chose to travel around, but he could go back home to his house whenever he wanted to. No. Jesus had no home. He was a pilgrim and a stranger in this world. He had absolutely nothing. And we base our success in this world so much off of how much money we've earned, how much money we've put in the bank, how nice our stuff is. And Jesus said the things that matter most are things you'll never see. This is the lesson he's trying to teach when he jumps into verse 16. Having said that, it says in verse 16, he spake a parable unto them. I don't know how long this lesson's going to be, so you might have some extra coffee donut time by the time we get done. So we'll see. It says in verse 16, he spake a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. Now right there, nothing wrong has happened. I don't want to point that out to you. If you don't have a lot of money, that's fine. Don't judge yourself based off of not having a lot of money. That's kind of the point. But if you have happened to be fortunate and success has found you in life, you don't need to feel guilty for that either. Right? Because we get confused about that verse that says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. Right? Because we think, oh, if I have money, that's going to corrupt me and make me evil. No, that's not what it's saying. Because you can learn to love money by having a lot of money. That's true. You can get used to letting that money solve all your problems for you, giving you clout and importance to people, and you can let that become more important to you than it ought to be. But you know how else you can learn to love money? Is by not having money. You know how often not having money, you say to yourself, man, I would love to just run up to town and get a cheeseburger. But I don't have cheeseburger money. You know how poor, how bad off you got to be to not have cheeseburger money? Like, what? It's like $3, $4 for a cheeseburger up in town. You don't have $3 or $4, brother. I've been there more recently than you might think. Okay, so but that kind of feeling, you're looking around and you're seeing all the nice things other people have, nice new clothes, or all the stuff that they have that you can't afford. That can lead you to love money too, right? That same sort of thing. So learning to love money isn't about being rich or about being poor. It's about your state of mind. What is most important to you? So the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And that's a fine thing. That's a wonderful thing. He says in verse 17, he thought within himself, this is his internal monologue to himself, dialogue, I guess, with the two parts of his personality. You ever done that before? You have a conversation with yourself in your own head? Yeah. And this guy takes it to the next level a little bit, and I kind of love it. He says within himself, "What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits." So, another really good problem he's got. The ground brought forth plentifully. He didn't expect this much harvest when he planted and when he worked and when he sowed and when he tended to the ground. All those months of work and harvest time came, and he reaped the harvest, and it was so much more than he had expected. And he didn't know what to do. He had so much stuff, he didn't know what to do with it. That's a fantastic problem to have. Sometimes you have problems that aren't so fantastic, but sometimes you have a problem that is just so great that you sit there in it for a minute. Let me just sit here and enjoy the fact that I have so much I don't know what to do with it. That's a fantastic problem. We don't count our blessings enough in life. We so often we get in a funk. We get in a funk because we always think about the stuff we got to get done, or the responsibilities we got to tend to. We get so caught up in our head with all of this stuff. We don't take enough time to count our blessings and to really appreciate all that we do have. There are people out there who have no family, they have nobody, and if you have people in your life, you ought to consider yourself blessed. You got a lot of family, you got a lot of people on your texting that you can talk to on a daily basis. You ought to consider yourself blessed for that. We don't think about these things often enough. You got a decent job, gets the bills paid, put some food on the table. You ought to be grateful for that. Really and truly. He had a good problem here. He's asking himself this question in verse 17. He comes to verse 18. He says, "This will I do." So the first part's him asking. It's almost like, anybody ever seen Lord of the Rings? You ever seen Gollum talking to himself? So there's Gollum and there's Smeagol. Is that little weird creature that you see, that little gray hunched over creature, And he said, he talks to himself back and forth. He says, "Nobody likes you. Not listening." And so he says so this kind of reads like he's talking to himself like that a little bit here. And so he's asking himself, "What are we going to do, me? Because we don't have enough room for all this fruit." And then the other hymn says, "Don't worry about it. I got a plan. Here we go. This will I do." He says in verse 18, "I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods." Let me ask you a question. What are your garages filled with this morning? Don't answer out loud. Just think to yourself, what are your garages filled with this morning? What are your attics filled with this morning? Now, we live in North Texas, so we don't have basements. But for people in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, what are your basements filled with? Stuff that you have no room for, that you didn't want to give up to somebody who else might have needed it. Let me tell you what happened this week in our family. Our kids, obviously Christmas time, they get a whole bunch of new toys and stuff, and they have more toys in this house than any two kids have any right to. I can't tell you how many times I've gone in there and told my kids, "You guys have too many toys." I guarantee you 75% of the toys in here you have not played with in years. And so what they did this week was they went through and filled, I think, like 2 or 3 totes full of toys that they never play with anymore, and we're going to donate them to some place that could really, to some kids maybe that could really use them. And that's the plan, because that's what we ought to do. We have too much stuff. We have stuff sitting in boxes all over the place, in barns and in sheds and in attics and in closets and garages all over the house, of stuff that we have no room for, that somebody else would absolutely kill to have, that we're just keeping to ourselves. Does it make you think about the rich young ruler, where he comes to Jesus? He says, "All these things have I done from my youth up." What does Jesus say to him? This one thing: "Sell all that thou hast and give half to the poor." You may realize how much Jesus is asking of him. Could you imagine if Jesus asked you to give up half your possessions? Half the things that you own, Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior, comes to you and says, "Give half your things up." How hard would that be? I can tell you, harder than it should be. He's pulling down his barns, he's tearing down the barns and building bigger barns because his barns aren't big enough to hold all those things that he owns. It's exactly where we live here in America. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world. I've never lived there, but where I live here, that's exactly the way it is. We've got more stuff than we need, while there are people out there that don't have enough stuff that they need. Jesus said, if you see your brother in need and have no bowels of compassions toward him, how dwelleth the love of God in you? You see kids in tattered, worn out clothes doing the bus ministry for as many years as I did it, and going around to some of these neighborhoods where it's more, mobile homes and that sort of a thing, watching these families that are doing the best they can, but they just don't have the money for new clothes all the time. And you see these kids wearing, worn out clothes and shoes with holes in them and that they've tried to patch up and that sort of a thing. It kind of breaks your heart for these kids. And when you know that there are houses all through these subdivisions all around us with shoes that those kids could wear just filled with boxes in a closet somewhere that nobody's going to do anything with, because every once in a while mom wants to bring them out and pull them out and cry over them. Look at how little their feet were. Some poor little kid could use those shoes. How many times Jesus told us to do that exact thing? Verse 19, he gets a little theatric with it. And I love this, one of my favorite phrases in the Bible. I will say to my soul, soul. He addresses the soul. He calls it out. That's the name. He says, I will say to my soul, hey soul, come here for a minute. I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And that's the goal, isn't it? Is to save up enough where you know you're set for life. You don't have to worry about tomorrow. You don't have to worry about a year from now. You've saved up enough where you're good. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, early on, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount. Very early on, he says in that very first sermon, think not for tomorrow. For tomorrow will take care of the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. That God will supply your need every single day as it arises. Hey, there's a bill coming up. I don't know how I'm going to pay it. Yeah, that's the idea. Because when it comes due, God's going to provide a way. You say, I don't know where the money's going to come from. Folks, can I tell you, I have so many times had bills come up due for things that I didn't know how I was going to pay for it. But when the time came, God provided a way. I've never been without water or electricity. I've never been without a home over my head or food to eat because God provided for me. You trust in the Lord, you're faithful to God, He'll be faithful back to you. God takes care of us. We don't need to trust in the power of savings and putting back. God will take care of us in these ways. We could be more generous with our things and with our money because there are people out there who don't know how they're going to eat today. We put so much importance in how much we have. This is what this man has done, and this is his mistake. We see that because in verse 20, God said unto him, thou fool. Now think about that he just said, because that doesn't sound foolish to me. A man who's been very successful. He's had a business. He runs maybe he's got a ranch. He's a farmer. And his farm has been extra successful this year. He's got more than he knows what to do with. So what does he do? He expands. He invests some money into himself. He expands his business. right? He has bigger storage and more places to keep things. He's able to make more money for himself and for his family. And he's able to make so much money, he's able to invest into his future. And he's doing really good. And God takes that man and calls him a fool. That's what just happened. Because our ideology of money is so turned on its head. If you have an excess of money, use it to help somebody. Donate to something. Help somebody out you know is in need. We shouldn't sit on all of this that we have. We should use it to help people. That's what the Bible teaches us so many times. For God to help us. He's saying you shouldn't have a retirement fund. You shouldn't invest in your future. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we could help more than we do. We could do more. This is for the man who invests in himself and nobody else. This man invests in his family and nobody else's family. He has no compassion for that family that's going to be sleeping under those bridges this week. Now, I want you to think about the weather. I want you to think about the wind. How many of you are going to bring your dogs in or set out heat lamps for them so that they don't have to sleep out in the cold? Now, how many of you realize you might be having more compassion for your dog than you do for human people that are going to be sleeping under bridges tonight? Children, people that are helpless, people that are handicapped, veterans, our heroes, sleeping out in the cold this week. Some of them might die from the cold. Remember the story of Jonah. He's standing on top of that hill looking out on the city, hoping that they all die and go to hell. God gives him a gourd, and it's hot out, so he sits under the gourd, and he loves that gourd. And the next day, God kills the gourd. And he's mad at God for killing the gourd, and he loved that gourd, and he's arguing with God about it, and God points out to him, he said, you have more love for that gourd than you had that city of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, where there are many people, children, cattle, all kinds of living things that are going to suffer because of this. You had more compassion for this than you did for them. It's very similar to what we see today. God help us. Thou fool, he says. This night, God says to this man, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. It's a very nice way of saying the man is going to die. That's what's happening. He's stored up for many years. He built all these huge barns. He's saved up. He's set for life. Little did he know, life was up. Don't let that thought scare you. For we Christians, we have eternal life. We pass through the valley of the shadow of death and we enter into life eternal. There's nothing scary about it. But that's why he says, thou fool. He says, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then here comes the question, then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? What happens to all your stuff? Right? And sometimes we make a will and we leave it to our family. Some people don't believe in doing that. I know some celebrities who don't believe in leaving all their fortunes for their family, and they want them to sort of learn how to provide their own way through life and that kind of a thing. So they, do with it. Then their will, they decide it's going to go all to charity or something like that. But that's the point. That stuff will do you no good when you cross through the valley of the shadow of death. The Egyptians, their pharaohs, they used to be buried with all their gold and all their things. And that's a ritual that's in several cultures that you can find in sort of sociology and archaeology throughout the world. Being buried with your things. You can't take it with you when you go. I don't need to be buried with anything. You don't need to leave me a ball and jacks in there. I'm not in there. I'm not going to get bored. I'll be kicking up gold dust. I'll be walking the streets of gold. I'll be walking alongside Peter and James, finally getting to answer some of these questions and say, Peter, why were you so hyper all the time in the Bible? And he might say something like, anytime I got sugar, I just got real hyper. I'll say, you know what, Peter, my brother's like that. You can't take it with you when you go. Investing in the future, and that's well and fine and good, but you don't know how much of a future you may or may not have. There are people suffering today. Let's do something to help them out. There are a lot of organizations out there dedicated to helping people that go out and provide shelters for the homeless, that feed the poor. We could do a better job of investing in those things. We could do a better job being the kind of Christians that Jesus described in the Bible. Because in verse 21, he says, so is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Right? So the trouble, again, like we talked about early on in the parable, the trouble is not laying up treasures for yourself. That's fine. It's laying up treasures for yourself while also not being rich toward God. It's investing in yourself, but not investing in people that are in great need. You're going to hear people say, well, you can't help anybody until you help yourself. That is not true. Don't live by that philosophy. I'll tell you why. Jesus didn't live by that philosophy. He didn't teach his disciples to live by that philosophy. We can help without having hundreds and thousands of dollars invested in the stock market. We could do more than we're doing. Let's lay up treasures for ourselves. That's just wisdom. But let's also be rich toward God. Well, that is our Sunday school lesson. Like I said, we're done a little bit early this morning. So we got a little extra time for coffee and breakfast and all that good stuff, fellowship with one another. So we'll be back to start the Sunday morning service at 11 o'clock.